Good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning to those in the US, North America. Good afternoon if you're with us here in Europe or Africa. And I guess it's evening in Asia, so welcome back. I see Louisa's on the call. Welcome, Louisa. Thank you for sharing that article earlier today. Just while we're waiting for others to join, Louisa doing some great work with their project and getting some media traction. So thanks for sharing that. Looking forward to chatting more about that.
Good to be here. Thanks for mentioning the article. I'll share it in the chat box.
Please do. It'll be so exciting for colleagues to see the good work that's being done. And hopefully they can copy you and follow you a good example. So colleagues, we are here at the end of module 3. We have a reflective session. It's not a very long session, but we have some time together. The purpose of our session this afternoon really is to pause and to reflect back and to clarify any questions we may have about the session, about the module that we've just covered. And so what I might do is, just while we wait for others to join, is touch on where we are in the program and refresh your memory to some of the content that we've covered. And I'm sure you may have questions or issues that you would want to go back to, maybe touching on some of the frameworks we covered. And so if you look through our program here, in module 3, moving from insight into action, remember the focus of the module has been using foresight to develop insights, strategic insights or policy insights or issue-based insights, that whatever the domain or the study of the focus of the foresight is, and then using those to enable action in an organization, in an institution. We covered that by looking really at 3 different tools. We did that in 3 parts. The one was about thinking in multiple horizons. If you look at module 3, part A, where we looked at the 3 horizons model, and you'll see the horizons model there on the right-hand side in that image, just giving you a visual reminder of the 3 horizons. We spoke about the first horizon, the second horizon, the third horizon. And you would remember we spoke about the role of different individuals in those different horizons, maintainers, entrepreneurs, innovators. We have different perspectives coming into the conversation. We then in part B looked at alternative futures and implications by using a tool called the wind tunneling matrix. You would remember with Pete Glenday using the wind tunneling matrix to think about implications, and he spoke at some length about how we develop implications. And then finally in that part C, we linked those implications to strategies for action. You would remember you had a session with Andrew Curry talking about the dilemma resolution and how in the case of the UN, you have the dilemma between participation versus legitimacy, and how do you manage that dilemma? And really it was an example of the kind of conversation you may have with your client or your ecosystem actors when you're bringing them those foresight insights. Now, we can go anywhere in the program. We can go back to any of the different aspects that we covered previously, but we might want to spend some time on module 3, really unpacking and reflecting. What have we learned? What have we found interesting or challenging? And so I'm going to give you an invitation that we've reminded ourselves of what we covered over the last few weeks, to maybe pose a question. You can use the chat or you can put your hand up. Maybe there's been something in the program that you haven't fully got your head around. One of the models, one of the exercises, you're trying to use one of them in the context of your experiment or in your everyday practice, and we can pause there and address any questions you may have. As you think about those questions, as I wait for you to put a hand up, whoever wants to come in on that, I might share a slide we used right at the early stages of the program, where we started talking about thinking about implications. Now, this was at the start of the module, where what are we trying to do when we think about implications? And there are really 6 things that we listed there. One of them is about challenging our assumptions. So what's interesting about that is when you're doing a foresight project, if we think about that against the backdrop of the different role players, if you have maintainers, for instance, who are the incumbents in an organization, it might be the case, it's very often the case, that they have very strong assumptions about the way the world is. So one example, decision-making in the UN. How is decision-making done? By, if you look 5 years ago, by humans in a room convened in person, having a plenary dialogue. It was very much the assumption about how decision-making happens in the UN. Fast forward to a post-COVID world, you've got virtual participants, not convened in person, convened virtually, and now we're moving beyond that to a blended kind of environment. Can we see a future where decision-making happens on the basis of AI? Not, of course, not all decision-making, but maybe some decisions are made on the basis of digital governance, artificial intelligence-based governance. Now, that's an extreme example, but it's an example of how Foresight can challenge some of our fundamental assumptions. If we knew that we were going to have a COVID pandemic disruption, maybe we would have built the capabilities for digital virtual convening and decision-making, et cetera, et cetera. And we can go into many examples of that. Let me pause there. Anyone with a question or a comment on some of the tools we've covered? For those who've just come in a little bit late, we're giving a recap and we're reflecting a little bit on module 3. Anything that you've been thinking about that you'd like to clarify? So as you're thinking about that, challenging our assumptions is, of course, one purpose. And when we're talking about the ordering process in Foresight, this module we've just been covering, we're developing those insights. And the purpose of developing those insights is to speak to those very strong assumptions, either the assumptions that we hold or the assumptions that others in the institution hold, and challenging those assumptions in a positive way, using those insights to perhaps shift those assumptions. And by shifting those assumptions, you can shift the entire direction of where that institution is going. Of course, the second one is an easy one, avoiding future surprises and threats. And so the question that I would have is, has the foresight that you're developing, if I think about the work Louisa and them are doing with communities, is the foresight sensitizing the community to the surprises or the threats that they might face? You could turn that threat into a positive. Is it sensitizing them to the opportunities that they might be confronted with? And so what foresight does, if you think about it as a cone, as a sort of cone looking at the future, what can happen in organizations is that cone can become closed. And so the organization can have a very narrow idea about what kind of threats. So if I take a UN type threat, a security threat, the sort of conventional threats would be state-to-state conflict would be a threat. If you went back 10 years or 15 years and you started looking at terrorism and the future of terrorism, you might say there's a looming threat of asymmetrical conflict. In other words, conflict between a state and a small actor who's a non-state actor. So asymmetrical conflict. If you look out another 50 years, you might say that there's a threat of digital conflict, so cyber conflict, but not state versus state cyber conflict. But what about asymmetrical digital conflict? So the risk of a small non-state actor with highly sophisticated capability using a digital threat to undermine, for instance, the satellite system that provides us with GPS. And so foresight can be used to instead of having a narrow sense of those threats, to open up those threats to a wider lens of what those threats might be, or what those surprises might be, or what those opportunities might be. So that's the second one, that when we're in this ordering phase of module 3 and we're developing those insights, what is the purpose of those insights? It can be to challenge our assumptions, to sensitize us. I can go through all of them. I'm going to suggest that we move on from this. You can look at them, anticipate the shape of the future, generate possibilities, extend the horizon, etc. Please raise a hand or pause if you have a question or there's something that you want to clarify. So in module 3, I'm reminding us a little bit of some of the tools we covered. I know that Pete Johan and Pete spoke about 3 horizons. You would remember him talking also about backcasting, portfolio analysis, road mapping, visioning. We did use wind tunneling, power and interest maps. Let's pause on that for a second. I'm going to take a breath and let's see if any of you have a question or a comment on any of those tools. These are, of course, just tools for developing insights, developing implications? Any of those stand out for you that you have a question about? So while we're thinking about that, you may or may not have a question. Johanna, I've got a question for you about when we use visioning versus when we use, say, alternative scenarios, descriptive scenarios. So visioning is a very particular one. We've said there in the language, it adds a normative frame. You want to unpack that a little bit for us? Why would a person in a foresight project select the visioning process? Or might we, maybe the better question is, why would we not select the visioning process in a foresight project? Any thoughts on that?
Well, just quickly before I answer that question, usually in terms of sequence of events, often we do the scenarios first, so that we have sort of explored the future and the many possibilities. And then based on what we find, we basically try to extract the best of those scenarios, or those aspects which are preferred, and we combine them into some sort of a fifth scenario, or how many scenarios we have. But this final scenario then would be our visioning process, really. One thing in terms of Marius, I don't know if I can exactly answer your question necessarily, but one thing that makes a vision sometimes complicated is the fact that, for instance, if you have a national vision, or at some point we had and this is a public project, but we worked for Portugal. We constructed a national dialogue process. And part of that national dialogue process is in the end to actually have a national vision for the future of Portugal in 2050. But we also realize that, you know, some people's preferred future is a nightmare for some others, especially also between different generations. So at some point it's sometimes difficult to really construct a clear vision. And then it's about the level of granularity. Sometimes the vision only deals with principles or values, you know, which are sort of signposts of how we see the future. And this is what we value in the future. However that might look like will be played out or discussed or worked out as we go on. So visions can sometimes be a little bit complicated to construct. Yeah, so Marius, I don't know if I'm answering your question. I think you're looking for something specific.
No, that's great. I'm looking at Tamara's comment saying, so it's the best to choose your tool to explore implications based on the scenarios that have emerged. It's quite a narrow cone with a clear vision of where stakeholders want to go. We use a roadmap where it's much less clear. So you raised a very interesting question. I'm going to come back to that in a sec. So Johan, what you're pointing to is when we're looking at the future, what immediately happens is there's a contest about, and you can ask very fundamental questions like, whose future are we talking about? Or you can ask a deeper question. Who is the one asking the question about the future? In other words, can we ask the question about the future on behalf of someone else? Or do we need them to ask that question for themselves? And so one of the difficulties when you start doing this kind of foresight work at a national level is there are multiple parties who have a claim on the future. It's their future. And those parties very often, and it's good if they feel this way, they don't want others to have a claim on the future on their behalf or dictate the future for them. They want to claim that future for themselves. And so you can have this tension between generations, you can have it between social classes, you can have it between race groups. And so actually what's very interesting about that, if we look at these tools, is there would be a way, and I'm going to intentionally change the slides to this view here, there would be a way of systematizing these tools. And so what Johan was suggesting, and for some reason, let me see if I can get this to work. My text box there is not working. Let me try this one. This might work. I think that's going to work. Let's try that. Oh, that's very interesting. My text refuses to work. In fact, I'll explain it without the slide. What Johan was getting at is that it is possible to systematize the tools. In other words, to use some of the tools as building blocks for others. And so in that particular case, as Johan was And there's the arrow now. It won't show up when I'm editing it. Murphy's Law. That what you can do is you can do a set of scenarios which deals with the uncertainty of the future. You can then do a visioning exercise which becomes more selective to that future. But what you also might do, if you look at the top right, where it talks about power and interests, you might take those scenarios and ask the question, in these stories, who has power? Who has interests? What kind of power do they have? What kind of interests do they have? So you might have a situation like with different generations, where one generation has power, but the other generation have interests and don't have power. So if you talk about sustainability, the current generation has all the power because they're making the decisions. The next generation have all the interests because their future depends on sustainable futures. And so what you then do is you take scenarios and visioning and a stakeholder mapping of power and interest, and you build together a project that addresses those different challenges. Now, what Tamara says is absolutely right. You don't only have to go with the narrow future, which is one vision. You could say, let's use pathways, which keeps that future open-ended and have multiple alternative paths. In fact, it becomes, at a national level, it becomes a little bit like the game of snakes and ladders, that to a country, to a nation, there are multiple ladders that they can climb to get up to what national progress looks like, but there might be multiple snakes in the snakes and ladders process that causes them to achieve undesirable outcomes, other risks that come into play. And so you could use those terms differently. I see Johan answering there. Roadmaps are more clear with certainty. Absolutely, that you can, where you have a sense of agency and planning, which we'll come to in the slides as well, which Andrew touched on. Colleagues, let me pause there. Maybe we've jogged your memory to think about something that you might be grappling with. Any other questions or comments? Anyone would like to come in and ask a question or make a comment? So as you're thinking about that, if there are none, what I'll do is I'll just touch on the slide very quickly, and I'll use my pencil instead of the way I was doing that earlier, which might work better. So you would remember us talking about the foresight process being first divergent, which we've spoken about many times, that we diverge with more and more detail and data and so on. The part we spend next, which is module 3 and 4, where we go next week with Kat Tully, is really the convergence to bring those insights home to decision makers. Now, something we haven't shared, which I'll touch on here, is what this moment here in the middle feels like. In other words, when you're doing a foresight project and you've taken your community or your executive or your client on this journey with foresight, and they've developed all of these insights, and some are broad and open-ended, that this moment in the middle can feel quite uncomfortable in terms of what are the implications of this? What does it mean for the organization? It can be daunting exactly tomorrow. You know, if you imagine and this often happens with organizations, you imagine a CEO who runs the organization, he or she has all the experience of having run the organization. They control the budgets, they control who does what in the organization. They have a high sense of certainty and control. And you come along and you ask them really tough questions that challenge their assumptions, that open up the future for them, even positive ones. The possibilities become greater. What starts to happen is they start feeling like they're losing a sense of control, or they're losing a sense of certainty. And so that can be quite a challenging moment. And so it's for this reason that we put an emphasis on the participative aspect. Because what can happen, and this happens with foresight projects often, if you don't involve the right people from the start, then by the time you get to stage 3, they can become an opponent of the insights. Not because the insights are bad, but because the insights threaten the status quo, and they are part of the status quo. And so what you can do, and I'm going to come to Johan for a reflection in a second. I don't know, Johan, if you've had experience with this kind of dynamic, but what can often happen by bringing a person into the process early, and they become part of the process, what then happens is they become the owners of the insights. The insights then are not your insights, the foresight practitioner's insights. It's their insights. They as a community have had what I might call an aha moment. And then what starts to happen, there's a very interesting theory of a guy called Kotter who talks about the theory of change. And he says, if you're going to bring about change in an organization, you need to create a burning platform, and then you need to create a guiding coalition for change. And what happens by bringing that person from the start of the process into the process, throughout the process, they become part of that guiding coalition for change. They become part of that burning platform that speak to the organization and say, we need to shift, we need to change, we need to adapt. And so that moment becomes a positive, creative moment rather than a moment of contestation and battlegrounding. Johan, any thoughts from you on that experience?
Yeah, maybe just one or two from our project experiences or experimental experiences. Is it is obviously best to be as inclusive as possible, and sometimes to get the right people in the room takes some effort, because often those people are not necessarily interested in participating in the experiment or joining the conversation. So at the start that might be already challenging, but having that co-design also not just of the content but of the actual process itself is extremely important. So what I mean by saying is it's not just about the theory or the content that will be discussed, but also how the process is designed. And it happened once or twice where, for instance, as we have to do an experiment or a project in Soft's case, and we were stretched on time in the sense that we had to be very hasty. And so we already designed the people, the process, and then cooperate the people at some time, pull them into the process. And more than often, it's because of time constraints. But what really happens is the lessons learned afterwards always is a reflection of the fact that, you know, it would have been great if you included us in the design from the start, etc. Especially if you have a strong participatory approach. So it's very, very important to have the people at the start, because also then you're guaranteed that you get the right and the best solutions your experiment wants to produce, because it's contextual and it's adequate and it's the best fit.
So thank you for that. I'm gonna to respond to Michael's question in the chat. I'm gonna roll back some of the good things that Johannes just said, because he's absolutely right. And but the way Johannes just described it, that's what we're aiming for, right? That's like the best case scenario, is that all the right people, all involved. The reality on the ground is what Michael's pointing to, which is that sometimes you don't have all the right people in the room. Sometimes you should have had someone, but they only come to the process late, or they chose only to participate in part of the process. And then what can happen, and this often happens, is they will question the process. Now, you would remember that we shared with you a quote by Jim Data, who said that any useful insight about the future must at first glance sound ridiculous. Actually, as a foresight person, I'm a futurist, right? I do this for a living. As a futurist, you sometimes have to be willing to sound ridiculous at first, right? Jim Data doesn't say it has to forever sound ridiculous. It must at first sound ridiculous. So if I say to you, are you a member of the digital UN algorithm decision-making platform on the moon in 2050? At first, that sounds ridiculous. But when you look at the trends, there's going to be humans on the moon. They're going to be building a way station to outer space. They're going to need to be governed. They're going to have rights. And the UN is probably at some point going to have to deal with someone there wanting to violate someone else's rights. And so the question is, are you part of the digital moon-based algorithm? So it sounds ridiculous until you unpack the story and the rationale for how you got to that story. Now, to Michael's question, how do you, and I like that word used, justify the scenarios. The way we do that is by never positioning yourself as the person with the answer. Because it's not, when you're doing participative foresight, it's not for the foresight facilitator to be the person with all the answers. That's not what foresight is. It's for the system to come with the answers. So instead of positioning yourself as the one with the answer, what you need to do is position yourself with the question. If you're the person with the quality question, so in other words, you say, these are the 4 scenarios which we think represent what the future might be. And then someone says, well, I don't agree. The response to that should be, why don't you agree? What is it about the scenarios that you don't agree with? And when they say, I don't agree with ABC, the response should be, that's very, very interesting. Let's think about that. Let's continue to stay in that question. And what very often happens is the reason they don't agree is because they haven't worked through the process in their own mind to come to the set of conclusions you've come to. And very often by staying in the question, they will resolve that for themselves and they themselves will have an aha moment. And that can be a real moment of vulnerability. So I'll give you an example is I've been in a room with a person who's the head of engineering for a corporation who vehemently disagreed with where we thought that the industry was going until they questioned us very strongly and they came to the conclusion that they were right, that we were right, that they were wrong. But the implications for them as the head of engineering was that they don't have the skills for the future that we were describing. So it's a real moment of vulnerability, but staying in that questioning space can be very powerful. The other reason it's powerful is because maybe they're right. Maybe your foresight process missed something and you have a blind spot. And by staying in that questioning process, you open the door for them to add to your insights to expand. And that's very much the spirit of how we do foresight. I like Johan's input there. Or let me start with tomorrow's actually saying, connected to that, we have to rely on those who are in the room, not the facilitators, also bringing others along with them on the journey. Absolutely right. Have to be good spokespersons. Seems to be a struggle in many organizations. So this raises a very interesting question tomorrow about the use of voice. And I think I may have put this in the chat previously in the program, but let me put it in again. There is such a thing as voice behavior. Now, when you're in an organization, different people have different levels of power, and they have, for cultural reasons, will have different levels of voice behavior. So in very autocratic cultures, there's what we call power distance. So they won't use their voice to speak up. There isn't what we might call, and I'll put it in the chat, a speak up culture. Now, what foresight offers us, if we use it the right way, it can create a mechanism for the voices who don't feel powerful to be heard in the organization. It can create a space for us to amplify some of those voices in the organization. And so one of the things we did, for instance, with our national scenarios, which we spoke about the other day, is we had young people narrate the scenarios, and we had young people dancing the dances that are the names of the scenarios. And the audience was 3 former presidents of the country, but they were learning about the possible futures of the country from the young people in the voice of those young people. And so one of the things you might do as a facilitator of scenario processes or as a commissioner of scenario processes is lend your voice to those voices who might be struggling to be heard in the system by creating the space, creating the process, creating the mechanism, amplifying those voices. It's such an important thing. Looking at Johan's comment there may be people who should have been in the room but were not. Agree. There are 2 levels: content, experiment, process. Very interesting, Johan, that from a subject matter expertise point of view, you may have missed someone, but you also may have missed someone as a stakeholder that should have been included. I like that differentiation. Very, very clever. Very insightful. Colleagues, we are slowly running out of time here for our session. I'm going to quickly touch on a couple of the models. We spoke about the 3 horizons with this messy middle. We spoke about the triangle that emerges between the maintainers and the entrepreneurs and others who are trying to innovate and those who might want to hold them back. We spoke in the module about the levels of agency versus uncertainty. And this is what Johan was referring to earlier, how pathways tend to be useful when there's high agency and high uncertainty, that we can use those pathways versus scenarios. We spoke about using the wind tunneling matrix. And we also spoke about this model of having to overcome the prescience challenge, of having to act in the space of uncertainty. Now, and then finally, we spoke about resolving the dilemmas that our insights represent in the organization. I want to pause there for a final opportunity. If there is anyone in the session who has a question, a clarifying comment, thank you for those who have already done that throughout the discussion in the chat. Anyone else want to come in and have the last word before we close? So I don't see any questions coming up in the chat. let me remind you that we do have the Q&A space available on HowSpace. So if you have a burning question and it's something you're uncertain about, or if you need some additional support with your experiment over the next days, as we start moving into module 4, you would want to be wrapping up the preparations for your experiment. And so if you need some additional support with that, drop us an email or drop a comment into the Q&A if there's anything we can do to help. We hope you have a lovely weekend coming up, and see you next week on Monday for module 4 part A with Kat Tully talking about integrating futures into the institution. Have a lovely weekend. See you soon.